status of human rights in Russia right now is extremely discouraging. We find ourselves rolling back in the Stalin times, basically, except for the number. But the spirit is definitely there. It is tremendously hateful to any manifestation of independent thinking, of independent action, and it is aimed at destroying everything that is still alive in Russia. My mother was one of the first people in the world who said that Putin's goal is to destroy civil society, to destroy whatever grassroots democracy was trying to emerge in the late 1980s and in the early 90s. Her statements were not understood. Russia became fascist on the level of the society and Nazist on the level of the ruling class. My parents were both born in the early 1920s. They were participants in the Second World War, or what by the Soviet propaganda was called the Great Patriotic War of 1941. They did not know each other until after the war, when my father was matriculating for Leningrad Medical Institute, and my mother was also applying there. They both became doctors, and in 1950 I was born to this pair of still students at the time. My grandmother on my mother's side was a very active communist, Bolshevik. She was involved in the efforts for creating the Soviet system of education, and especially for the care of the homeless children in the 1920s. She was married to another ardent communist. My grandfather was executed in 1937 as a traitor and the enemy of the people, and my grandmother was sent to the Gulag, the Stalin labor camps. She survived, and she came back home in 1947 clandestinely because she was not allowed to reside in large cities. She found my mother at the same address, a young woman who was trying to enter the medical school. And my mother was a disabled war veteran. The doctors advised very strongly against pregnancy. It may have proved completely fatal, or at least threatening her complete blindness. My mother won that argument. She had me. 6 years later, she had my brother. In 1970, met Sakharov, and in 2 years after that, they were married. The understanding and the love that they shared was completely unprecedented to me. I have not seen another union where they would be so much part of each other. They were so much on the same wavelength, always, even when they argued. And once my mother said to a friend, "Don't worry, we are not quarreling. We're discussing his draft of constitution." I think that the story of my family prepared me to accept Sakharov as a phenomenal human being whom both myself, my brother, and by then my husband came to respect greatly and really admire and love as a friend. Our life from that time on was 100% associated with the work Sakharov did and my mother did. My mother became involved in human rights movement before she met Sakharov. In fact, this is why she met him. So I grew up on one hand like a normal Soviet child, but on the other hand, I knew something that was not really supposed to be discussed in classroom in high school or in the university. In 1968, the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia, and I already knew whose side I'm on. I was 18 years old by then. My future husband, whom I have known since 1964, when we both were 14 years old, was also on the same side. And we began to become closer. And in 1968, we acquired the so-called Tamizdat edition of Dr. Zhivago. My future husband would come and sit through the day because we couldn't allow the books to leave the house, or especially to jeopardize him in his capacity of a Soviet student. So we have become very alienated. Our frame of reference leaned towards human rights ideology that Sakharov founded. And so we became very fast friends with him. And my husband eventually became his representative in the West when we left the country. The Soviet authorities tried to use whoever was close to Sakharov as an instrument to force him stop his human rights work. And so eventually we became such hostages and such pawns. So we decided to immigrate under great pressure, which also involved several threats to the life of our son. First when he was 1 year old, and then when he was a little bit older. And so finally in September of 1977, we gave in to this pressure and we left the Soviet Union. We had no document. We had a little piece of paper with a photograph. I with my son, my husband with our daughter. The children did not have their separate visas. They were written into that visa of their parents. 3 years later, we became permanent residents. And 5 years later, we became American citizens. I decided that I do not want to apply to be a Russian citizen under Vladimir Putin in the direction that he had led Russia in that time. And then I was not able to re-enter for 10 years because I left Soviet Union as a stateless person. When I came back to Moscow in 1987, this was an absolutely incredible time of hope among so many, the staunchest critics of the Soviet regime. Then came the first Congress of People's Deputies. Sakharov took active part in it, and it was clear that the very conservative and bordering on Stalinist part of the first Russian parliament will not allow the building of a democratic structure. And as Sakharov himself put it, we have started building our country from the roof. You cannot start building from the roof. You have to have a foundation. Our foundation, he insisted, is constitution. He was the only person to draft a constitution. In the summer of 1988 and 89, he was drafting the constitution, sitting in the grape pergola in my house in Newton, Massachusetts, United States of America. And so that was a wonderful memory. He would work from 7 o'clock in the morning until my mother would get up and they would have breakfast together around 10 o'clock. Didn't even want any tea or coffee. He was very modest in his desires and his expectations of a daily life. Now we deal on an everyday basis with extremely cruel treatment of people who are sick, of people who are dying in the camps, of people who have been injured as a result of beatings, as a result of denial of medical treatment. We have so many examples of that. Even though the numbers are different, this is truly the spirit of Stalin Gulag. I don't know what needs to be done, how to force a regime that is now fighting a completely senseless war aimed at destruction of an entire nation, a destruction of everything that's still standing and functioning in Ukraine. How can we expect to change? I can think of only one thing. If Ukraine is not allowed by the community of free democratic nations and enabled to win in this war, we are not going to have any improvement in Russia. We, the democratic community, the human rights community, we need Ukraine's victory in order to enable any change in human rights situation in Putin's Russia.